Now, before we get into this story, I want you to do something for me. Get comfortable, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of story that's going to sit with you long after this video ends. This is a story about dignity, about what happens when small men with loud mouths mistake a quiet man's patience for weakness, and about the moment, that one devastating, beautiful moment, when the truth walks into the room and changes everything. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories on this channel that you will not find anywhere else. Stories about real people, real pain, real triumph. And if you've been here before, you already know we don't rush. We don't cut corners. We sit inside these stories until you feel every single second of them. Now, let's talk about Sergeant Major James Caldwell. Picture Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The year is 2003. The sun doesn't ease into the morning here. It arrives like an order, hard and immediate, turning the red Carolina clay into something that radiates heat from the ground up. The air smells like diesel fuel and cut grass, and something metallic that you eventually realize is just the smell of discipline, of structure, of a world that runs on rank and regulation. This is a world where a man's worth is measured not by where he came from, not by the color of his skin, not by the softness of his upbringing, but by what he has proven, what he has survived, what he has sacrificed. At least, that's what the uniform is supposed to mean. James Caldwell understood that from the time he was 8 years old, watching a military recruitment poster on the wall of his mother's church in rural Mississippi. It showed a soldier standing at attention, chest decorated, chin lifted, eyes forward. And even as a boy, even in a town where the roads turned to mud in the rain and the school got the textbooks that the white school threw away, James looked at that poster and thought, that is a man who cannot be dismissed. That is a man who cannot be ignored. That is a man who has made himself undeniable. He carried that thought for 30 years. By 2003, James Caldwell was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, steady-handed, built the way men are built when life hasn't been gentle with them. Not bulky, not showy, just solid. The kind of solid that comes from carrying weight for a very long time. His eyes were calm in a way that only comes from having seen things that would break most people. 3 combat tours, desert, jungle, urban warfare in streets so narrow 2 men couldn't walk side by side. He had carried wounded soldiers on his back. He had made decisions in the dark that he would never fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. He had a voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. When James Caldwell spoke, something in the air changed. Something biological, almost like every nervous system in the room recognized that this was a man who meant what he said. He grew up in a house with no father. His mother, Dorothy Caldwell, cleaned other people's houses 6 days a week from the time James was born until the time her knees gave out. She ironed other women's curtains. She scrubbed other families' floors. She came home every evening smelling like bleach and standing straight as a board, because Dorothy Caldwell believed that how you carried yourself was the one thing nobody could take from you. She told James that before he could read. She told him that every single day of his childhood. He never forgot it. He joined the army at 18 with nothing but a duffel bag, his mother's voice in his head, and a hunger to become something that the world had to reckon with. And by God, he had done exactly that. By 2003, Sergeant Major James Caldwell had spent 20 years earning every single stripe on his uniform. Every commendation, every decoration, every line in his service record had been written in sweat and sacrifice, and the kind of quiet excellence that doesn't ask for applause because it doesn't need it. He had been passed over for promotion twice. Both times, the men promoted above him had fewer tours, less experience, and records that didn't come close to his. Both times, James had filed his paperwork, straightened his uniform, and continued doing his job at the same exceptional level he always had. Not because he wasn't angry. He was. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. But because Dorothy Caldwell's son did not let other people's failure to see him determine how clearly he saw himself. Now he was arriving at Fort Bragg for a new assignment, to train a fresh batch of recruits. Young men who had never been anywhere, never done anything, never been tested by anything harder than a hard coach or a hard exam. His job was to take those raw, unformed young men and turn them into soldiers, into something that could withstand pressure, into something that could hold. He did not know when he drove through the gates of Fort Bragg that morning that the greatest test of his 20-year career was not waiting for him in a desert or a jungle. It was waiting for him at formation. Now I need to tell you about Lieutenant Derek Holt, because every story about a good man has to have the other kind. Derek Holt was 26 years old. He was the kind of handsome that photographs well, but doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Sharp jaw, perfect posture, the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He came from a military family in Northern Virginia. His father was Colonel Richard Holt, a man with deep connections, a longer memory, and the particular arrogance of someone who had spent decades confusing authority with righteousness. Derek had grown up on stories about his father's service, about the Holt name, about legacy and tradition, and what it meant to carry a family's military history on your shoulders. He had absorbed all of it. He wore the uniform like an inheritance, like something that had been given to him rather than earned. And that was the problem, because Derek Holt had never actually earned anything. His recommendations came from his father's colleagues. His evaluations were written by men who had dinner at his father's house. His promotions moved faster than his record justified, and somewhere deep in a place Derek never examined too carefully, he knew it. That knowledge didn't make him humble. It made him dangerous. It made him the kind of man who needs to diminish others because he secretly suspects he cannot measure up to them. He had been at Fort Bragg for 8 months before James Caldwell arrived. In that time, he had built a little kingdom in the barracks, a clique of like-minded recruits, young, white, entitled, and bored, who followed Derek's lead because he was charming and his father was powerful, and it felt safer to be inside that circle than outside it. They had a culture, this group, a way of talking, a set of casual cruelties that they dressed up as humor and wrote off as just the way things are. When word came down that a new sergeant major was arriving to lead their training, Derek shrugged. He'd outlasted 2 training officers already. One had requested a transfer. The other had retired early. Derek had a way of making environments uncomfortable for anyone who challenged him. He had never met anyone like James Caldwell. He had no idea what was coming. I also need you to know about Private Marcus Webb, 20 years old, skinny in the way of young men who were still growing into their frames. From the south side of Chicago, which means he had already survived things that most of these recruits couldn't imagine. He had a mind like a trap, sharp, fast, retaining everything. His mother had worked 2 jobs to keep him in school, and Marcus had honored that sacrifice by being the kind of student that teachers remembered years later. He joined the Army because he believed in something. That's rarer than it sounds. Most people join for money or structure, or because they don't know what else to do. Marcus joined because he genuinely believed that service meant something, that the uniform meant something. He had a photograph of his grandfather, a Korean War veteran, that he kept folded in the front pocket of his uniform. From the moment Marcus arrived at Fort Bragg, he watched. He observed. He noticed who had real authority and who was performing it. He noticed the way Derek Holt's crew operated. He noticed the jokes that weren't quite jokes. He noticed the way certain men were treated differently. And he noticed that the people in charge seemed either blind to it or complicit in it. And then James Caldwell walked into the barracks, and Marcus noticed something else entirely. He noticed a man who had already won every argument he would ever need to have, and who was in no particular hurry to have them. Marcus Webb decided in that first 5 minutes that he would rather be James Caldwell than anyone else he had ever seen in a uniform. He didn't know yet what that decision was going to cost him. He didn't know yet what it was going to mean. But he was about to find out. Now I want to ask you something before we go further, and I want you to actually think about it. Have you ever walked into a room, a new job, a new school, a new neighborhood, and felt the temperature drop when you arrived? Have you ever felt the shift in the air that tells you, before a single word is spoken, that some of the people in that room have already decided who you are? That they've looked at you and made up their minds before you've opened your mouth? Think about what that feels like. And then think about what it takes to walk into that room anyway. To stand up straight, to speak with authority, to do your job at the highest possible level in an environment that is actively working to make you feel like you don't belong there. That's what James Caldwell did every single day. And if that kind of strength moves you, if this story is already getting under your skin the way it's supposed to, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed, because we have a long way to go and it only gets more intense from here. James Caldwell's first formation was a Tuesday morning. 6:15 a.m. The Carolina sun was already climbing. He stood at the front of 3 rows of recruits, 42 young men in fresh uniforms, some standing at attention the right way, some approximating it, all of them sizing up this new authority figure the way recruits always do. James looked at them for a long moment before he said a single word. He had learned long ago that silence is one of the most powerful tools a leader has. Let people sit in it. Let them wonder. Let them fill it with their own assumptions, and then speak into whatever space is left. He introduced himself without theater. Sergeant Major James Caldwell. 20 years of service. 3 combat tours. He told them what he expected. He told them what the next 6 weeks would look like. He told them that the only thing he would never tolerate was a lack of integrity, not physical weakness, not slowness, not inexperience, because all of those things could be corrected. Integrity, he said, was something a man either had or he didn't, and it was his job to find out which kind they were. He was 8 minutes into his address when it happened. It was subtle, a murmur, low enough to maintain deniability, a sound that was shaped like words but couldn't quite be proven to be words. And then a ripple of laughter from the back of the formation, small, quickly stifled, but real. James didn't stop talking. He didn't look in the direction of the sound. He finished every sentence of his address exactly as he'd planned it, dismissed the formation with precision, and watched 42 recruits disperse. Marcus Webb didn't disperse. He stood in place for a moment, his jaw tight. Because Marcus had heard it. Marcus had been standing 2 rows ahead of Derek Holt, and sound travels at formation, and Marcus knew exactly what had been said. The word that had been said. That word. Said low and casual, and wearing the costume of humor. Said by a lieutenant in the United States Army about a sergeant major with 20 years of decorated service. Said like it was nothing. Like it was normal. Like it was acceptable. Marcus looked at James Caldwell's back as the sergeant major walked away, straight-spined, unhurried, giving nothing away, and Marcus thought. He heard it too. He knows. And he kept talking anyway. What kind of man does that? The answer, Marcus would come to understand, is the kind of man who has chosen his battles so carefully over 20 years that he never fights one he can't win. The kind of man who knows that reacting is not the same as responding. The kind of man who has been waiting, with the patience of someone who understands history, for exactly the right moment. That moment had not arrived yet, but it was coming. The mocking didn't stay subtle for long. Within the first week, Derek's clique had a name for James that circulated through the barracks in whispers. Monkey in uniform. That was what they called him when they thought no one was listening. When the officers weren't around. When they were in the showers or the mess hall or walking between buildings in groups of 3 and 4, doing the math of cowardice. The calculation that tells you it's safe to say terrible things as long as you're surrounded by people who will laugh instead of report. They were systematic about it. They would sabotage drills in ways that were difficult to prove. A timing error here, a miscommunication there, always with a plausible explanation ready. They would follow James's orders with a half-second of hesitation that was just long enough to be disrespectful and just short enough to be deniable. They spoke to him in tones they would never use with a white officer of equivalent rank, and when he corrected them, they made faces to each other behind his back. And then Derek did something that crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He filed a complaint. A formal written complaint, submitted to Colonel Strickland, the base commander, and a man who had been golfing with Colonel Richard Holt, Derek's father, for the better part of 15 years, claiming that Sergeant Major James Caldwell had used excessive and inappropriate disciplinary measures during training exercises. The complaint was vague in its specifics but serious in its implications. It suggested a pattern of behavior. It used language that, if taken seriously, could derail a career. Colonel Strickland took it seriously. Not because the evidence supported it. It didn't. Not because the complaint was credible. It wasn't. But because Richard Holt's son had filed it. And because Strickland had spent his career understanding which way the wind blew and positioning himself accordingly. James was placed under informal review. Nothing official. Nothing that would appear immediately in his record. But a shadow. A question mark hovering over everything he did. An instruction to certain people to watch him closely and report back. And James Caldwell continued doing his job. At the same level of excellence he had always maintained. Not because he was unaware of what was happening. He was completely aware. But because Dorothy Caldwell had raised a man who understood that the most radical thing he could do in a system designed to trip him up was to refuse to fall. In the evenings, after the day's training was done, Marcus would sometimes find James sitting on the steps outside the barracks. Not brooding, not performing peace, just sitting, breathing the evening air, occasionally looking up at the sky with the expression of a man who has a private conversation going with something larger than himself. One evening Marcus sat down next to him and didn't say anything for a long time. And then James spoke first. He said, "Marcus, let me tell you something about 20 years. And he told him. He told him about the first time he was called that word in uniform. He was 19 years old. Basic training. A drill sergeant who thought it was funny. James had gone back to his bunk that night and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours. He told him about the first time he was passed over for promotion. He had a perfect record. The man promoted instead of him had 2 disciplinary citations. He told him about the soldiers he had carried, the ones he got home and the ones he didn't. He told him about the desert at 3 in the morning when the only thing between survival and the alternative was the man next to you. And at 3 in the morning in the desert, nobody cares what color that man is. They just care that he's there. He said, "In 20 years, I have never broken. Not once. Not because I wasn't hurt. Not because I wasn't angry. But because the moment I break, I give them what they've always wanted. Proof that I didn't belong here. And I have always belonged here. I belonged here before they knew my name." Marcus Webb listened to every word. He held on to every word. And something shifted in him permanently. The way something shifts in you when you witness a person who has decided, with complete and unshakable conviction, exactly who they are. He looked at James and said, "What are we going to do about them, Sergeant Major?" And James looked at the sky and said, "We're going to wait. Are you still with me? Because I need you to be still with me. Because we are approaching the part of this story that I think about at night. The part that made me want to tell it. And before we get there, I want to know, drop it in the comments right now. Have you ever had to hold yourself together in a situation where everything in you wanted to explode? Have you ever had to be the bigger person when being the bigger person felt like an injustice in itself? Because James Caldwell was about to face something that would test every ounce of everything he'd built over 20 years. And the way he handled it is the reason we're here tonight. Don't go anywhere. Subscribe if you haven't already. And let's keep going. It was a Wednesday morning. Week 3 of training. The heat had settled into Fort Bragg like an uninvited guest who decided to stay, pressing down on the parade ground with the particular cruelty of a Carolina August. Formation, 6:15 a.m. 42 recruits in 3 rows. James Caldwell was at the front, addressing the formation on the day's training schedule. His voice was level, authoritative. The recruits were at attention. Most of them were genuinely listening. And then Derek Holt, standing in the second row, did not whisper. He did not murmur. He did not use plausible deniability. He looked at the back of James Caldwell's head, and he said the word. Loudly, clearly, with a smile in his voice that was worse than the word itself. The formation went absolutely silent. Not the silence of people who hadn't heard. The silence of 42 people who had heard perfectly and were now holding their breath, waiting to find out what the world was made of. Marcus Webb's hands balled into fists at his sides. He felt the blood move in his face. He felt something rise in him that was hot and old and prehistoric. He wanted to step out of formation. He wanted to say something. He wanted to do something. But he watched James Caldwell, and he did not move, because James Caldwell did not move. And Marcus had decided weeks ago that he was following this man's lead wherever it went. James Caldwell stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned around slowly, not with the speed of a man who has been surprised, with the deliberate, measured movement of a man who has been waiting. He looked at Derek Holt, and in the absolute silence of that parade ground, with 41 witnesses standing in formation and the sun bearing down and the whole weight of 20 years pressing into this single moment, James Caldwell said 9 words. 9 words. Quietly, clearly, with the finality of a door closing on something that can never be reopened. Fall in, Lieutenant. You just made a career-ending mistake. Then he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his personal cell phone, and made a call. Right there. At formation. In front of everyone. He didn't step away. He didn't lower his voice. He stood at the front of that formation and waited for someone to pick up, and when they did, he said only this, "Sir, it's James. I need you to know that something happened this morning at Fort Bragg that requires your attention. I'll send the formal report this evening, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." Then he hung up. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one before. This was the silence of 41 people trying to recalibrate, of Derek Holt's smile fading at the edges, of the certainty that had been in that smile curdling into something else, into the first whisper of fear. Derek recovered quickly. He laughed, short and dismissive. He looked at the recruits on either side of him as if to say, "Can you believe this?" The laugh landed wrong. Nobody echoed it. One recruit took a small, almost imperceptible step away from Derek. Then another. James Caldwell looked at Derek Holt for exactly 3 more seconds. Then he dismissed the formation and walked inside. That evening, Marcus Webb went quietly, methodically, from recruit to recruit. He didn't pressure anyone. He didn't ask anyone to do anything against their will. He simply said, "If you heard what happened this morning and you're willing to put your name on a statement saying what you heard, now is the time." 18 recruits submitted written witness statements by midnight. 8 of them were white. Now I need to tell you about a phone call. The man James Caldwell had called that morning at formation was not a friend in the ordinary sense of the word. He was a superior officer, a man named General Raymond Whitfield, 61 years old, silver-haired, decorated Vietnam veteran, the kind of military man who had spent his career collecting the respect of people who did not give it easily. General Whitfield had met James Caldwell in the desert in 1991. Desert Storm. A situation that Whitfield never talked about publicly and that James had never told anyone about because it wasn't his story to tell. What I can tell you is that in the desert in 1991, in conditions that would end most men, James Caldwell had made a decision that meant Raymond Whitfield got to come home, got to watch his daughter graduate from college, got to meet his grandchildren, got to grow old. Whitfield had stayed in contact with James for 12 years after that. Not performatively, not because he felt obligated, because he was the kind of man who understood what was owed and paid it without being asked. He had written letters to the promotion boards on James's behalf. Twice those letters were ignored. He had never stopped being furious about that. When James called that morning, Whitfield listened to the measured, composed voice of a man he had known for 12 years describe what had happened at formation. And when James was done, Whitfield sat in his office for a moment. Then he picked up a different phone and made his own calls. He did not announce his arrival at Fort Bragg in advance. Colonel Strickland found out General Whitfield was on base when a junior officer knocked on his door, white-faced, and said, "Sir, General Whitfield's vehicle just came through the main gate, and he's asking for a full briefing on the Caldwell incident." Strickland sat very still for a moment. He thought about the informal review he had placed James under. He thought about the complaint Derek Holt had filed, the complaint Strickland had accepted and acted on without adequate investigation. He thought about the calls he'd received from Colonel Richard Holt asking him to handle the situation delicately. He thought about 18 witness statements that now apparently existed, submitted by recruits who had been standing in formation on Wednesday morning. He thought about General Raymond Whitfield, and he thought about the particular way a career ends when it ends badly. Colonel Strickland was not a stupid man. He was a weak one, which is a different thing entirely. He understood in that moment, with the clarity that fear provides, that he had allowed himself to be used by a powerful man to do an unjust thing to a good soldier, and that the bill for that was now due. Meanwhile, Derek Holt had gotten word through the network of his father's contacts that something was happening, that the informal review he had expected to use as a weapon was turning around. He did what weak men always do when they feel control slipping. He accelerated his justifications. He began telling anyone who would listen that James had provoked him, that the environment was tense, that his words had been misunderstood, that the witness statements were biased. He called his father. Colonel Richard Holt began making calls of his own, reaching out to people with authority, asking favors, pulling threads. He had spent 30 years in the military building a network precisely for moments like this. He was confident that he could manage the situation. He had managed situations before. What he had not accounted for was the weight of 18 witness statements. What he had not accounted for was General Raymond Whitfield, who was not in anybody's network because he had never needed to be. And what he had absolutely not accounted for was the classified service record of one Sergeant Major James Caldwell, which 2 of Derek's crew had pulled up on a base computer that evening, trying to find ammunition, trying to find a history of complaints or disciplinary action, and had instead found something that made both of them sit back from the screen. They had found a distinguished service cross citation. They had found 3 combat tours. They had found 16 acts of commendation across 20 years. They had found the record of a man who had been, by every measurable standard, one of the finest soldiers to pass through the United States Army in a generation. One of those recruits went to find Marcus Webb. He sat down across from him in the mess hall, and he said, "Marcus, who exactly is Sergeant Major Caldwell?" And Marcus Webb looked at him and said, "He's the man who's been giving you the chance to figure out what kind of soldier you want to be." He left it at that. General Raymond Whitfield convened the formal disciplinary hearing on a Friday morning. The room was a standard military hearing room, functional, spare, designed to communicate that what happens here is serious and procedural and without sentimentality. A long table, chairs, the American flag in the corner, the weight of the institution pressing down on everything. On one side of the table, Sergeant Major James Caldwell. Beside him, a JAG officer assigned to ensure the process was conducted correctly. James was dressed with the kind of precision that communicates respect for the proceeding, not for the people who had put him in this chair, but for the institution he had served for 20 years and refused to dishonor even now. On the other side, Lieutenant Derek Holt. His civilian lawyer father, Colonel Richard Holt, sat in the back of the room, present, but without formal standing. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved around the room calculating. Colonel Strickland sat to the side, in the position of someone who is present but no longer central. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 4 days. General Whitfield sat at the head of the table. He opened the proceeding without preamble. He had every statement read into the record. He had Derek Holt's original complaint read aloud. He had the witness statements, all 18 of them, read aloud one by one. He had James Caldwell's service record entered into evidence. Each time a witness statement was read, something happened in Derek Holt's posture. Something that started as defiance and gradually became something else. He had told himself that the statements were exaggerated, that people were confused, that the moment had been misconstrued. But hearing each statement read aloud in the formal language of military proceeding, plain, specific, unambiguous, he began to understand that there was no version of this he could talk his way out of. His father sat in the back row, still, calculating. The calculations getting harder. When all the evidence had been entered, General Whitfield looked at James Caldwell and asked him to make a statement. James stood, and he was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man gathering his thoughts, but the silence of a man who has had his thoughts gathered for a very long time and is choosing, carefully, where to begin. He said, "I did not survive 3 wars, bury 16 brothers, and serve this flag for 20 years to be called an animal by a boy who has never heard a shot fired in anger. I have served in deserts where the only thing between life and death was the man beside you. And I promise you that in those moments, nobody asked what color that man was. We asked, is he capable? Is he committed? Will he hold? I have held. In every environment this army has put me in, I have held. I have been passed over. I have been undermined. I have been questioned by men whose records do not come close to mine. And I have continued to serve at the highest level because I have always believed, that what this uniform represents is worth more than the failures of the people wearing it. I am not standing here asking for sympathy. I am not standing here asking for anything that was not already owed to me before I walked into this room. I am asking for the United States Army to be what it claims to be, to mean what it says it means, because I gave it everything. And it deserves to be held accountable to its own ideals, just as it has always held me accountable to mine." He sat down. The room was silent for a long time. General Raymond Whitfield looked at the table in front of him. He looked at James. And then he stood up, and his voice, when it came, was quiet and absolute and final. He said, "Lieutenant Derek Holt, you are formally discharged from the United States Army, effective immediately, for conduct unbecoming an officer and for actions that violate the foundational principles of military service. Colonel Strickland, you are relieved of command pending a full investigation into your handling of the complaint filed against Sergeant Major Caldwell and your conduct throughout this proceeding. Sergeant Major James Caldwell's record will be formally commended, and the informal review will be struck from any associated documentation." He looked at Derek Holt. He said, "You were given a privilege that most men would have died for. You wasted it." Then he closed his folder, and the hearing was adjourned. In the back row, Colonel Richard Holt sat very still. The network he had spent 30 years building had not been enough. The calls he had made had not been enough. The name that had opened every door for his son had not been enough. Because the thing about a man like James Caldwell is that his record doesn't need anyone to advocate for it. It advocates for itself. Derek Holt was escorted from the building. He walked past James Caldwell on his way out. James did not look at him. Not out of anger. Not out of victory. He simply had nothing left to say to this man that hadn't already been said by the preceding. Some people spend their whole lives being told that who they are is not enough. And they spend their whole lives proving, quietly, undeniably, in everything they do, that they are more than enough. And one day, not always, but sometimes, and this was one of those times, the record speaks so loudly that no amount of cruelty or connection or inherited privilege can speak over it. Derek Holt walked out of that building into a morning that looked exactly like the one before it, but felt entirely different. And whatever he was going to do next, whatever story he told himself about what happened, he was going to have to carry the truth of that hearing with him for the rest of his life. In the days that followed, something happened on that base that nobody had ordered and nobody had planned. Marcus Webb was formally recognized for his role in coordinating the witness statements and was recommended for accelerated advancement. He received the recommendation from General Whitfield directly, and when Whitfield shook his hand, Marcus thought of his grandfather's photograph in his breast pocket and had to work very hard to keep his composure. Several of the recruits who had submitted statements sought James out individually. They came one by one. Some of them had something to say. Some of them didn't. They just stood in front of him and extended their hand, which said everything that needed saying. One of them, a young man from a small town in Georgia, a young man who had laughed at Derek's jokes in the first week because he didn't know yet what kind of man he wanted to be, stood in front of James in the hallway outside the barracks. He opened his mouth twice before anything came out. His eyes were bright in the way eyes get when a person is carrying more emotion than they know what to do with. James looked at him. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder. He said, "You did the right thing when it mattered. That's all this uniform has ever asked of any of us." The young man nodded. He couldn't say anything. He walked away and James watched him go. And something in James's chest settled, the particular quiet of a man who has just witnessed, in real time, the thing he has always believed in. That people can choose. That even people who have made wrong choices can feel the weight of those choices and turn around. That the uniform means something. That it is worth defending. That it is worth being. That evening, James sat on the steps outside the barracks. The Carolina evening had arrived the way evenings do there in August. Slowly, the heat not disappearing but transforming, the sky going through colors that have no names. He sat alone. He didn't have his phone. He didn't have his paperwork. He had one thing. A photograph. Worn at the edges, soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded so many times over 20 years. His mother, Dorothy Caldwell, standing in front of a house she had never owned, in a town that had never given her what she deserved, smiling the way she always smiled, like she knew something the world didn't, like she had already made peace with every difficulty and come out the other side of it intact. James looked at that photograph for a long time. He didn't cry. Dorothy Caldwell's son didn't cry in the way most people cry, with sound and collapse. His eyes just became very bright, the way eyes do when they're full of something that doesn't have anywhere to go. He looked at his mother's face, and he nodded. Slowly, like a soldier reporting back to his commanding officer. Like a son keeping a promise. He said, very quietly, to no one and everyone, "I held, Mama. I held." And then he put the photograph back in his pocket, straightened his back the way she had taught him before he could read, and watched the Carolina sky finish its business with the day. I want to leave you with something. James Caldwell's story is not just a story about one man. It is a story about the thousands of black men and women who put on a uniform and served a country that did not always serve them back, who sacrificed in deserts and jungles and cities on the other side of the world for a flag whose promises did not fully extend to them at home, who were passed over, dismissed, undermined, and demeaned, and who kept going anyway, not because they had given up on the promise, but because they believed in it more fiercely than the people trying to break them, who understood that the way you defeat someone who wants to see you fall is to refuse, with every single thing you have, to fall. Dignity is not given. It cannot be given. It can only be held. And some people hold it so tightly, through so much, for so long, that it becomes indistinguishable from who they are. It becomes the thing that defines them. The thing that outlasts every insult, every injustice, every Derek Holt who ever stood in a formation and thought a word could diminish a man who has buried 16 brothers and carried the wounded across enemy lines. It cannot. James Caldwell taught us that. And if this story moved you tonight, if you felt something in this story that you needed to feel, then do something for me. Leave a comment. Tell me about a time you had to hold yourself together. Tell me about someone in your life who held when everything was pushing them to fall. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not yet part of this community, subscribe right now, because we do this every week. We sit inside stories that matter. We stay until the end. We don't cut corners, because some stories are worth every minute. And James Caldwell, Sergeant Major, decorated veteran, Dorothy's son, the man they called a monkey in a uniform, was worth every single second of this one. Thank you for being here.